welcome everyone to another OII lunchtime seminar. I am Professor Ekaterina Hertog, an associate professor in AI and society here at the OII. To everyone online and in the room, welcome to the Living with Digital Surveillance in China, Citizens' Narratives on Technology, Privacy and Governance. We're delighted to have Professor Ariane Ollier-Malaterre. I'm sorry.
You're doing great.
I should have practiced. So a wonderful colleague with us today to discuss how Chinese citizens make sense of digital surveillance and live with it. Dr. Ariane Ollier-Malaterre is a management professor and the Canada Research Chair in Digital Regulation at Work at the University of Quebec in Montreal. Her research examines digital technologies and the boundaries between work and life across different national contexts. She has co-authored over 75 chapters and articles in management, sociology, psychology, and information systems journals. She co-chairs the Technology, Work and Family Research Community at the Work and Family Research Network and has received the Cantor Award for Excellence in Work-Family Research. So we're really delighted to have you here. A few housekeeping points. For your awareness, the event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. The presentation will run for about 30 to 40 minutes, followed by a discussion at the end. If you are joining us online, please put your questions into the Q&A box, and those in the room, save your questions until the end, and Ariane will answer them after the talk. If you're online and wish to ask questions with your microphone or camera on, please raise your hand during the Q&A sessions and we will call on you. Be aware that this then will be included in the recording. It's great to have you here, Ariane, and looking forward to the talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Hertog, for your kind invitation. I'm very honored today to be presenting my book and very happy that the room is packed. I hope you will want to read the book after that. So the book explores how Chinese citizens make sense of digital surveillance and how they live with it. It's been published last October in the Routledge Studies in Surveillance series, and I want to acknowledge the Chinese colleagues who invited me and enabled the fieldwork, as well as the doctoral students who were my interpreters and the participants to the research. Many colleagues who helped me navigate the book process. This is my first book. And generous endorsers and book reviewers. Surveillance isn't unique to China. It's a worldwide phenomenon. Actually, there's a very interesting field of studies on surveillance in the UK. But it's particular in China. I would say it's more intense in China. And one of the reasons for that is that in China, people leave digital traces every day. They use all-encompassing platforms, also called sticky apps, super apps, such as WeChat. And for all of those in the room and online who may be using WeChat, you know that it's a very convenient, frankly, and all-encompassing app that you could use not only to talk with friends and entertain yourself and check the news, but also to work. It's more used for work than email in many Chinese workplaces, and you can use it to call a taxi, pay your transport. Even if you want to give money to a beggar on the street, they have QR codes. You can pay your taxes, check your utility bills, check the media, access public services. So in a word, it's very rare now that people use cash in China. It's for very old persons or foreigners. And even now, actually, it's easier for foreigners to use Alipay. There are ways now to create an account. You don't have to have friends wire you money as I had to do when I was traveling. So because of that, people leave a wealth of digital traces every day. And on top of that, you have a very dense network of facial recognition cameras. You have real name registration for internet activities. And that is very important. So when you go and buy a cell phone, you have to hand out your ID card and that's tied to your phone number. And when you create your accounts online, that's tied to your identity. So you're fully traceable. You may have heard, because that's been a hype in the Western media, of the social credit systems, and I insist on the plural here, because there's no such thing as a unified, all-encompassing system as has been depicted sometimes in the Western media. That's a myth. But there are a range of social credit systems in different municipalities and commercial platforms. So all of these make surveillance in China quite intense. My book is at the intersection of surveillance, privacy studies, internet studies, and of course, Chinese studies. And I've asked, rather simple questions. To what extent do Chinese citizens notice digital surveillance in their daily lives? What do they know about it? Its different facets, because it can be rather opaque. Do they change their behaviors in anticipation of it? What do they think of it? How do they make sense of it? How do they explain it? How does the context shape their discourse? And last but not least, how do they feel regarding their constant exposure to surveillance? This project has been perhaps one of the most difficult I have ever undertaken, and it's been very, very humbling. I am not a sinologist, so if there are people in the room or online who are from the Oxford University China Center, this is a caveat on my part. My background is in sociology, in psychology, in management. What I do have is 20 years of experience interviewing across different cultures. So I plan 2 years ahead of a sabbatical leave to go interview people in China. I secured invitations in 3 universities. It wasn't easy, but I have a chapter retracing how I did that. Secured the research fees as well. Took Mandarin courses in my university. 3 semesters isn't enough. Just enabled me to get by and travel by myself in China, but not, of course, to conduct semi-structured qualitative interviews. I was very aware and concerned about my Eurocentric biases, so I really worked hard to try and overcome them. What I did was I took a series of perhaps unorthodox decisions. I began my research with a solo backpack trip along one of the Silk Roads, making use of the high-speed trains. Before I started the interview, I really wanted to immerse myself. And I took an inductive approach. So I read Chinese fiction, watched movies, stuff like that, but not the scientific literature on contemporary China or surveillance in China. I only read that literature after I had conducted the interviews and I had coded them and I had the initial drafts of the coding structure, because I really didn't want my data to be contaminated by all the pre-existing Western literature on the topic. And I do have lots of interview excerpts in the book because I wanted to give a voice to the participants. My analytical lens is polycontextual. That's a French sociology framework where you look at context of the system with multiple layers, including the historical, the cultural, the socio-political, and economic context. So what happens when you come as a foreigner in China to conduct field work? And as you can see, I very much look like a foreigner. There's no doubt about that. So I wrote down a research diary as I was traveling and spent time on the campus. And I conducted 58 research interviews in Beijing, Chengdu, and Shanghai. They are all Chinese citizens, except 3 foreigners who were married to Chinese partners and had longstanding residence, mostly face-to-face interviews. Half of them happened in English because the participants wanted to conduct them in English. They were proud that they were able to do that. And the other half was in Mandarin. And of course, I had interpreters who were doctoral students, whom I had trained towards, conducting qualitative open interviews. A number of challenges, and I have a whole chapter in the book on self-censorship, and maybe we can discuss it in the Q&A section. And I have a chapter as well on methods, on the different challenges. How do you try hard to listen to participants and convey that you're not here to judge, you're really here to learn and to try and understand what's going on with them. Try to put your own baggage at a distance. It's easier said than done. How do you navigate sensitive? That's code work for political, of course. You do get political speak, you do get self-censorship, of course, but how you do try to buffer your participants, your interpreters, and your colleagues from the potential risks of participating in the research. So I have a small sample. The book does not claim to be representative of China. My sample also remains more educated and urban than what I had wished for, because, you know, recruitment goes through the professors and the doctoral students. And of course, this means the network of exchanging favors is biased towards more educated people. I tried really hard, like, you know, interview taxi drivers, dormitory hands. I do have secretaries. I have migrant workers in hairdressing salons. So I do have a fair proportion of different, perhaps more representative people in the sample. So I'll walk you through the key findings before I delve into a couple chapters of the book. The first thing I want to say is that there have been cross-cultural quantitative surveys that noted that on average, Chinese citizens tend to support digital surveillance in China more than, for instance, US or UK or German citizens. And the book provides an explanation for that. So what I found, the first key finding is that participants wove a cohesive system of narratives, and that taken together, these different narratives framed digital surveillance as indispensable in China to solve China's problems. So the way this cohesive system worked is that on the one hand, you had three anguishing narratives of moral shortcomings that produced shame, fear, and anger, and produced an impression that China needed to be saved. And in response to that, you had the very convenient redeeming narratives of digital protection that answered the anguishing narratives and acted as an antidote. So if I want to go a little more in depth into these narratives, so the first one is the lack of moral quality. There's a huge literature. I hadn't read it before I conducted the interviews, but then I realized there's a huge literature on the lack of moral character, moral integrity in China. So the first narrative goes that in China, many people lack education. And because of that, they supposedly act as children, and they need the rules and the punishments to be educated. So again, that's not my thinking here. It's the narratives that I was given. So that because of lack of moral quality, it made it necessary to treat people as children and to monitor the rules to ensure moral progress. So the participants said, we actually welcome things like the social credit systems, because this will help people understand the rules and educate them. Then we'll have a more moral and civilized China, you know, the important theme of civilization in China. The second theme was the century of humiliations by foreign powers. And again, for sinologists in the room, that's a very well-known and core trope here. So it was combined with continued fears to be attacked and humiliated by either Muslim populations in China or foreign powers outside of China. It's what sinologists called a culture of insecurity or a civilization complex. And it sets the stage for the imperative for China to revive its ancient glory and retrieve its rightful place on the international scene. So again, people were saying, if we have digital surveillance and people behave better because of this, then we can show to the world that we're a civilized and glorious nation. And the third one was privacy as hiding shameful information. It was seen in a negative way, and therefore surveillance helped to uproot the secrecy and again ensure moral progress. I'm going to go to this one into more depth. So you see this very negative way of framing the current state of the Chinese society set the stage for seeing the government as a parental figure of protection and order that can safeguard against all these anguishing narratives, and also of technology as a magic bullet. There was a really effective and proud discourse on technology that participants were very, very proud of the pioneering technologies of China, facial recognition and going to the moon and other things like that, that helped to rebuild civilization in China. So that's what I found at the discursive level. But at the same time, I heard people fearing exposure to surveillance, and I heard people trying to convince themselves that they were not personally exposed to surveillance. So the second really important finding that I want to point out is the intra-individual tensions between what they said at the discursive level when they were asked what they thought of surveillance, and what they felt at the emotional level when I ask, so how does this make you feel? And when I heard their body language. So the other side of the medal that you see here is the huge mental and emotional weight that exposure to surveillance triggers for people. Participants develop mental tactics to defend themselves at the psychological level and try to convince themselves that they were not the targets of surveillance. I'm going to go into more depth on that one. And they expressed anger, frustration, resentment, objections. And of course, there was a lot of self-censorship as well. If I wanted to summarize in very simple terms this underlying paradox, it could be summarized as surveillance is good for China, but I don't like it, and I'm trying to forget about it. The book is structured to reflect what I just explained. So the first part, of course, gives you a bit of literature review, because this is an academic book, on the constructs of privacy and surveillance and the history of surveillance in China, because it's not new. It's a practice that's centuries old. The second part details the anguishing narratives. The third part's the redeeming narratives. And the fourth part goes into the mental and emotional weight of surveillance, including self-censorship. So let's go into a little more details on 3 of these chapters. Understanding privacy in China is very important because the way you see privacy shapes how you see surveillance. And the understanding in China is both similar to understanding in Western countries and different. And it actually was quite hard for me to figure out. Face in Chinese thought has, well, let's begin with the words for privacy in Mandarin. There are 2 words. The first one is quite similar to the Western definition. So privacy is something you do not wish to disclose in public, whatever the nature of it. Maybe the latest book you've been reading or what you had for breakfast doesn't have to be shameful. You just don't want everybody to know. And the other word for privacy is quite distinct. It means hiding a shameful secret. And when I ask participants questions about what's private for you, how do you understand it, very, very clearly they answered, it's the hiding of something that would cause me to lose face. So what was important for them was to control the exposure of shameful information and feelings to social groups that could judge them negatively. What they said is privacy is important to maintain social and moral respectability. I love this quote. It was puzzling for me. So this young girl, she said, you'd never shoplift with a friend because you would be so ashamed if you were caught with your friend, seeing you stealing from the shop. But you might take a chance if you're alone, even if there are cameras, because you don't know if someone's watching the camera. And in any case, it's not your mom watching the camera. So that's more or less okay. So what do you hide? Face in Chinese thought has at least 2 dimensions. There's the moral face. So the things you would hide are the behaviors, thoughts, and emotions that could be judged negatively by others. So people would say, if I wanted to buy personal medicine, that's good for Viagra. If I wanted to buy sex-related products or, weapons, I would try to buy that using cash. And face can also be the social face, because you can induce shame by signaling that someone has a lower status than you have, so it works both ways. If you make too much money, you don't want the person to be embarrassed, and if you don't make enough money, you don't want to embarrass the person. You don't want to embarrass yourselves. So you also hide financial information. And who do you hide from? Well, you hide from the social groups that are close to you and that can make you lose face, rather than from the government. And actually, that is quite similar to Western research on privacy that found that people don't have the government on their mind, on their radar, as much as social groups. So that's true also in the West. Then when you ask people, who would you like to hide things from or safeguard your privacy from, they will say their friends, they will say their family, much more than corporations or governments. Parents and supervisors, I was told you give them fake news because you don't want them to poke around. Hackers, but not abstract entities such as the government. One thing that was, really telling in that respect is people discussing Weibo. So Weibo is like Twitter. You can get a pen name, but remember, there's real name registration. So it's tied back to your identity. But still people say on Weibo, you can be different. You can be yourself. You can write your true feelings. Probably, note the probably, you never quite know. Nobody identifies you. It's an escape. I was like, but what about real name registration? But no, of course, it's not on people's radar. They forget about it. You give it once when you give your cell phone, but then you forget about it. So privacy imaginaries in the Chinese context, wanting privacy is often seen as suspicious. If you claim privacy, it's because something's not quite clean and you want to hide it. And also you seek privacy from the social groups you belong to, more from the companies or the government. So surveillance in that context is associated with positive outcomes because surveillance helps to uproot the secrecy and clean people up, if you would like. And state surveillance may not be viewed as much as a threat than in other country context. So how do people cope with surveillance? It was really interesting to me that almost 9 out of 10 participants in the research developed mental tactics. So ways to protect themselves and try to convince themselves that they were not the target of surveillance. So 4 main tactics here that I'm going to go into more details with some quotes. The first one was brushing surveillance aside, with minimizing or denying that it existed. People would say nobody's watching. There are cameras, but they don't have the money to for people to watch all the time. So when they need it, perhaps they check it, but otherwise no one is watching. Once at some point I got frustrated because I got that discourse again and again, and I was on a train and a recording played warning passengers about misbehavior, and they said if you misbehave on a train, it's going to go into your credit file. So I recorded it and I played it out to a participant, and even then, hearing it, she said maybe they're bluffing. So trying to really deny that it's there, and in some cases it's bluffing, because the way the panopticon works is you only need people to think that they are being surveilled, not necessarily surveil them actively. Ignoring surveillance, it was super impressive, the capacity of people to just ignore cameras. For instance, I would ask questions about cameras and they said, where? I was like, well, here. And I was like, oh yeah, actually you're right, there's a camera, okay. But they had deliberately ignored it. So if I don't like these ideas of losing my privacy, I choose to ignore it. I don't think of it. So here's the illustration of that, these attempts to ignore the surveillance on the social credit system. Some people said it's science fiction. We don't have that system, you know, and I insisted you don't have. No, we don't have the social credit system. We don't have this, where there had been documentation that this was happening. Other people, and actually this was an IT developer, he said it can be done technically, and that's a good point. It's super hard to integrate all these databases. So I don't know if they have the technical knowledge, and it's not just knowledge. And other people said, yes, it exists. I've heard about it, but it's only financial, which it is not. It is also behavioral. Another way to brush surveillance aside is to normalize. So say, yes, we're being surveilled. Well, everybody, you know, in the world is being surveilled, and that's just normal. Everybody in China does it. Everybody provides their information, their address, their ID. And this example, it's like the metro. When they started to scan bags, people were irritated. They said it was useless, but 1 year later, everybody lines up and has accepted it. It makes us feel secure. It also happens in other countries. So people would say, yes, we're being surveilled in China. Most governments use social media as a tool to spy. Well, that's a fair point, isn't it? Third way, reframing. So some people said, yes, it's true. There are books that we cannot buy, but it's temporary. It's not going to be forever. Redefining the scope of freedom. We value freedom. The country makes the laws, the regulation. It's the bottom line for all people, meaning we have to accept that. The other behaviors of my freedom, for instance, what I will have for lunch. So you redefine the scope of what freedom means. And comparisons with history, you know, we are freer than we used to be. Comparisons with other people. My friends in the government, they cannot travel abroad without submitting their passport, but I'm in the private sector. I'm free. I can do what I want. Or saying, yes, you say you're free in the West, but you have drugs, you have firearms, and that's not freedom. So a whole lot of reframing going on. Another interesting tactic was othering surveillance targets. So I'm a small potato is a very common expression. I can see you recognize it in China. So people would say, I'm not someone who's important. I'm just a social, normal person. There's no reason for anyone to want to surveil me because I'm not interesting. So I heard that a lot. And actually, to be fair, in Western countries, you hear that a lot as well. I have nothing to hide. You know, I'm not interesting. Or people would say, I'm a good person. And interestingly, I had full-grown adults saying to me, I'm a good boy, I'm a good girl, you know, very also infantilizing themselves. And they will say the blacklists, they're just for criminals. I have nothing to fear. And when I ask, but do you always know what you should do, what's legal, not legal? Are there any gray areas? And maybe the blacklist could be a problem for you. And they would say, no, as human beings, we know. We avoid bad behaviors. We don't think our score will be reduced. Or they said, it's a good thing, you know, because I obey the rules and I want the other ones who don't obey to be caught. The third tactic was wearing blinders. So trying to, you know, not look too much outside of it. So focusing on daily life. Is it impacting my daily life? Is it impacting me directly? You know, it depends how the system is used. So they would object to a social credit system that would prevent them from borrowing money and buying a car, buying a house, for instance. But they would object to it not because there are rules and punishment and surveillance, not in principle, but because of the pragmatic consequences of the system. This was so salient that I almost titled the book "So Far, So Good." They said, you know, it won't harm me at present. So far, it does not do actual harm, so I'm not that concerned. And I got some lecturing as well. Oh, you Western people, you worry about, you know, too many things in the abstract. When it's coming, well, think about it. When it's far from us. And the last one was fatalism. You can't do anything about it, so helplessness. So, a rational psychological way to cope with this is say, well, I don't care, this doesn't matter. Yes, they know how much I spend and where I am, that's unavoidable, so I don't care. Nobody can avoid it, I just accept it. And this one I think is very touching. We are little potatoes, the government is always right, we need to obey. It's like in Orwell's book, Animal Farm. And please note, this person didn't quote 1984, which is, the usual stereotype about Orwellian surveillance. And I went to reread Animal Farm, and I have to say, I understand why they would quote this one and not 1984. So 9 out of 10 participants developed one or the other or several of these mental tactics to try and cope with surveillance, which on the discursive level, they accept and support, so very interesting paradox. But when you push it further, and I was able to do that with about 50% of the sample, you also hear very strong misgivings and objections. With half of the sample, I observed acute awareness of surveillance and restrictions. So people are not naive. So they would say things like, sometimes on WeChat, some articles that I post or some articles are deleted. Sometimes I know it's the truth, meaning, this was misinformation, it's rightly being deleted, maybe the truth. Sometimes it's reasonable, sometimes not, so they try and assess it. Our generation, we have more constraints. We had access to YouTube, Facebook, things go in a spiral. So they are very, very aware. Maybe in the first place, it was for financial purposes, but then it's behaviors that they want to control. So very articulated thinking about what's going on. And this person was a CPC member. In general, I had, several CPC members, and they were super articulated in the way they thought about surveillance, very well informed. I had some rare behaviors, that actions that people took to limit surveillance exposure, like putting stickers on QR codes, using the company's address to have packages delivered. This person knows, if I watch an illegal copy of a movie, I should not put it on Baidu because they scan it and they delete it. 50% of the persons expressed very, very strong feelings. Dislike, unease, frustration, dread, fear, anger. Look at this one. The feeling of being monitored is not good. It feels like not being treated as a human, more like a lab mouse in an experiment.
What percent did you say?
50%. Yeah. I don't like being monitored. At work, it would be like having an eye over me, behind me, that would feel as a constraint. This person was really, really angry. Fear. Like, if you wanted to buy a book that criticizes the government, or sometimes naive questions, I remove them afterwards. You can't do that in China. Once I bought such a book in Taiwan, but at the airport, my mother asked me to throw it away. And why? And she said, they are afraid. They went through the Great Cultural Revolution. They haven't forgotten. Or people will say, we feel fear if the system is abused, or it could be used incorrectly. Another interesting thing was the support for generalized surveillance, but the refusal to be singled out. They said, I'm happy to give my fingerprints at the airport because it treats every passenger the same, but it's not okay if it's just me being singled out. It's simpler, it's more efficient for the government to manage. I understand the reason, but I don't want to be monitored. So always this discrepancy. There were marginal but very elaborate objections to generalized surveillance. So most people really cared about, am I being the target? What's the consequences for me? But some people had more general abstract objections. They said surveillance was inefficient, and that's what workplace monitoring literature actually shows. They said it's not natural, it's not human to ask somebody to be surveilled all the time and suppress their emotions. They said we should favor education of citizens more than punishment. We value freedom, And this person went as far as saying, you know, we're supposed to be a communist country. So if you use the social credit systems to give privileged access to some over others, who gave you the power to differentiate us in that way? So ideological objections to surveillance. So in conclusion, this book is the first attempt to de-Westernize the literature on privacy and surveillance, the culture of surveillance. That's the work of David Lyon, one of the pioneers of the field, has been normalized throughout the world. But in China, it's framed in specific nationalist and culturally embedded meanings because of age-old surveillance practices, because of pejorative meanings assigned to privacy, because of all the discourse on national memory that's very distinct from national history in every country, but specifically in China, and because of techno-nationalist views, techno-optimistic views of technology as a civilizing force, not just a technical solution, but a force of moral progress to re-engineer society towards greater morality. So the contribution of the book to surveillance and Chinese studies are to highlight this paradox and these intra-individual tensions in China, because on the one hand, they frame digital surveillance as indispensable, but on the other hand, they fear exposure and they try to convince themselves they are not exposed. There is a huge debate in the surveillance literature between, you know, viewing it as caring from the minority that may deviate from rules, or viewing it as coercion. And what I show here is when you ask people about how they think, they view it as caring, but when you ask about emotions and affect, they view it as coercive. Further contributions outside of China. I said, you know, surveillance is a worldwide phenomenon. So I hope this book invites readers to a critical examination of what's going on in our own countries and contexts. May surveillance and privacy narratives in our context be moral as well? And if that is the case, what's the content of these moralities? And lastly, the book is accessible to the lay public. If you don't want to read the literature reviews, you don't have to. All the other chapters are full of interview excerpts and are, I hope, I've been told they are easy to read and engaging. So I hope you'll want to read this book.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the fascinating talk. I will now open the floor to the questions. I will just chair asking the questions. I'll try to take one. If we get a lot online, I'll try to alternate. Otherwise, focus on the room if there are not many questions online. So without further ado, are there any questions? And King and Estella. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. That's fascinating. So, I think you mentioned like people respond like seeing the government as the parent to govern and rule. And from my point of view, it's reflecting the very patriarchal Confucian ideology, where like in the Confucian bonds and virtues, monarch, father, and husbands are considered young in the yin-yang diet. And that's the superior side of relationship. And sometimes the emperor is referred as fatherly monarch. So I'm wondering if there are like a gender differences between shown in your observation.
Interesting question. First of all, thank you for asking and highlighting this point, because that's a clear example of how the Chinese cultural and historical context makes surveillance imaginaries different from in other countries, although they share similarities on other aspects. So the parental figure was mostly masculine, as you've pointed out. And it's true that the Chinese government and at different levels are mostly, while they are more masculine than feminine in any case. I didn't see gendered differences in terms of the respondents resorting to the parental figure trope, but it was definitely a masculine protection trope. So the government as a fatherly figure, and this idea of the family protecting you. Right. Thank you.
Estrella?
Well, thank you for your research, sharing your research with us today. I was really curious to the point you had about an interviewee noting when her posts were taken down. How common among your interviewees was it for them to have had an experience of content they posted being removed? And were those the moments in which perhaps it became more acute for them? They could other the focus on privacy controls, instead had to kind of reflect on its direct impact on them.
Well, I had several participants mentioning posts being taken out. I cannot give you a percentage to that because that's the thing with qualitative interviews is I did not always ask the same questions to everybody, in particular sensitive questions. Like this one, I only, ask when the interview went well and I felt that I could go into that zone. It's super sensitive, right? Censorship. So I maybe I ask it to less than 10 participants overall, because there's this dance with the interviewees, and I'll see if there are questions on that, but you have to adapt your questions to each person and how it's going. Thank you.
We had a question in the back. Yeah.
It's actually very related to that. I wonder if people who have went through like if being punished or like posts taken down, or in the airport example, I guess it would be a different story if they actually try to sneak in the book and got caught. But in your case, I actually just threw out the book before even go through the security. So I wonder for those people who are actually punished in any way by the surveillance system compared to those who not, are there any differences that you observe?
There weren't that many examples of that type because again, with some interviewees, I had to be more cautious and these are the interviewees, the half of the sample that were more did express these incidents or these exposure to potential threats, but I think anticipatory obedience was more common than trying to sneak in the book, for instance, because that's what surveillance does.
Yeah.
I find the language thing in the interview very interesting, and I really appreciate that you let the participant to choose whatever language they want to use in the interview. But I'm also wondering if someone's doing the interview in English and if their English is not that fluent, they want to practice with a foreigner, then for specific terms like social credit system, is it they ignore or deny that, or is it simply because they don't know that term in English? So do you think language can influence your interpretation of their recognition of surveillance in your everyday life?
Well, it could have been the case. For some of the interviews in English, I also had an interpreter, so in that case, I had cases where the interviewee for one part of the interview said, "Do you mind if I switch in Mandarin?" I said, "Yes, of course." And then they, explained it to the interpreter who explained it to me. But even for the others without an interpreter, I didn't use abstract terms. Like I never said surveillance, for instance. I never brought the word surveillance, and they didn't use it either. I didn't say social credit systems. I said the traces you leave when you buy online, the cameras, the blacklists, because actually it's people know the blacklists much more than the social credit systems, and they are more relevant to daily lives. So blacklist is a very well-known term. I don't think even, with the language thing, that would be a problem. What was a problem, of course, is they weren't as able to elaborate in abstract terms their own thinking as if they had done it in their own language. Thank you.
So we've got starting questions coming in online as well. So I'll start alternating. So I'll take a note, but we've got a few questions before you, sorry. So we've got Daniel Christensen online saying, "Thank you very much for a very interesting topic. Is there any evidence that this technological surveillance is actually making people feel safer over time, rather than them saying or hearing the government say? Is it actually making society safer? Or is it just a belief in technology more than any effect?"
Interesting question. I do think it makes people feel safer, and they give me so many examples of that. They mentioned, child kidnapping, which used to be a terrible problem in China. As many as 200,000 babies or small children being kidnapped each year. And the retrieval rate of these children was 0.1%. So almost no chance to retrieve them. And people have told me, you know, I used to avoid going to Shenzhen with my children because it was a town where you would have lots of kidnapping because it's close to the borders. And now I can. There's cameras everywhere, and I'm not, you know, I feel safe. I can go to Shenzhen, I can go everywhere. So many people told me I feel safer. I got examples of a grandfather who had dementia in a rural area, and he wandered, you know, in between villages in the field and fell asleep in a field, and they were able to track him. And that person said, if we had had more cameras, if it had been in a city, we would have found the grandpa before, you know, he spent the night in the field. So people petitioning for more cameras in parking lots, building parking lots, things like that. And we were joking last night, you know, you park your bike here at Wadham College and you said, and the door wouldn't close, and they said, well, okay, there's a camera. It's okay. I do think cameras make people feel safer. But at the same time, of course, there's this the other side of the medal that what you do, where you go, with whom is retraceable. Yes.
Ziyu, and then we'll have question online and then question in the back. Yeah.
Such wonderful field work. It's really fruitful. So my question also traces back to what have you already commented on, like the multifaceted nature of surveillance. So at what point do the participants actually acknowledge that this kind of process, I recognize it as actively watching on my personal life? So because like there are more obvious surveillance types, and there are more like hidden surveillance type, and there are also like unspoken surveillance, but people know they're happening. So the different layers of surveillance technologies influence people's recognition of its existence.
Very, very interesting question. Not easy to answer. I think people notice most when it impacts them personally or through critical incidents. For instance, one person said, I went to rent a bike. And the first time you want to rent a bike, you have to provide your ID and you have to provide your phone number, etc. Well, not just in China. And at that moment, I questioned it. You know, do I want to do it? And that person didn't. But then he said, you know, the traffic is such a mess in this city that I think that eventually I'm going to do that. Another example is an after-school teacher. You know, after-school classes was great. It used to be a huge business in China. It's been curtailed now, but so she was teaching English after schools, and I noticed in the room there was a camera. So I asked, because we did the interview in the room where she was teaching on small chairs, you know, it wasn't comfortable at all, the kids' chairs. And I said, there's a camera here. Do you think we're, you know, can we do this interview? Are we being filmed? And she was like, no. It's just, you know, when we teach. And then I went, so how do you feel that you're being filmed all the time that you teach? And she explained it, you know, parents need that because they want to ensure that the teacher teaches properly. And if one kid bites the other, you know, well, small kids again, they need to know who started it. And then she went to counsel me because I said something like, oh, I would feel uncomfortable if I was filmed. And she was, oh, you just have to be natural and that's how you handle it. And, you know, teach as if it wasn't there. I was like, thank you. So it's when it, you know, when it comes at your face, that's what people said, you know, if I can ignore it, I will ignore it because I don't want to see it. But if I have to give my fingerprints, I'm faced with a critical incident. Oh, another thing, people hated the pay with your smile, a new technology. You go to the grocery and you don't even have to have your phone with Alipay or WeChat Pay. You just show your face, and because you have registered, they know it's you, and so you have your groceries, you show your face and you're off. And but they didn't like it because they couldn't ignore it. It was in their face, literally. Yeah.
Okay, we got next questions online from Jianan Shi. She's saying China's social credit system is still under development and currently functions more as a model setting initiative, a common governance practice in China. Methodologically, interviews were conducted using the broad term social credit system. How would you approach introducing this system, given that it has yet to take definitive shape in China?
Yes, I'm actually writing a whole new piece in a collective paper on that, because a group of China studies scholars and myself, we are reflecting on fieldwork and the challenges. And I acknowledge that, it was very, very difficult, this issue, because I went in the field in 2019 with literature up until 2000 and the end of 18. And at that time, we didn't really know, even experts didn't really know what the social credit systems were and were not. So if you look at the literature, the papers that began to debunk the myth were published in 2000 and late 2019, 20, 22, and so forth. So I went in with a very opaque and influx phenomenon. So what I did was to ask very careful questions to participants. I introduced my questions saying, the media has reported that perhaps if you behave in that way or that way, your score could be reduced. We don't really know. It's what's being reported. What do you know about it? And what do you think? Would that be acceptable or not? Would that be justifiable or not? So that we try to co-construct and co-assess these practices because they were in flux. But as I also write in this piece, I made mistakes, and my other colleagues, they made mistakes too. Because, for instance, I gave wrong examples of behaviors such as, if you buy diapers, your score could go up. If you watch too much video games, your score could go down. This has never happened. We know this now. But these examples came from a manager of Sesame Credit, had been reported in a Chinese newspaper, and I had thought this source was credible. So I used it. It wasn't. But this shows you how difficult it is to conduct field work in a phenomenon that's opaque, that's prone to misinformation, that's influx, pilots everywhere. So you go in with questions, and when you see the literature 2 or 3 years later, you wish your questions had been different. We can only, have reflexibility and a knowledge that we do the best we can when we go in with the knowledge that we have at that time.
So the question in the back?
Yep. Did you get a sense from anybody about their feelings on actively evading the surveillance mechanisms and infrastructure, like using VPNs or anything like this? And if so, whether there was also a suspicion that these working evasion technologies might also be part in some way of the surveillance infrastructure itself.
Could you specify the second part of your question?
So there's some VPNs which work in China, and there's some suspicions that these are part actually of the surveillance infrastructure.
Got you. Okay. Yes. So some people, especially the IT developers or IT architects, were super aware of different ways of escaping surveillance. One person in Baidu actually told me that they had instructions to not use Baidu Cloud for internal Baidu projects. So, and most people I talked to, except maybe the migrant workers, they had VPNs, they knew how to use them. But they also knew, I don't know, actually. Well, yes, some of them said, I think the government knows what's going on because the VPNs, they work super well at certain times, but comes a CPC anniversary or an important international meeting, then all of a sudden there's no way to connect. So they know how to enforce the firewall if they want to. So this means that if they allow the VPNs, they know who is using a VPN. And so yes, it's part of the infrastructure of surveillance.
So we got question line and then so hope I pronounced correctly. Hui-Chen Liu online says, "Hi Ariane, I like your analysis on how freedom and privacy are redefined in China. Could you explain how you ask interviewees about politically sensitive topics, such as the education camp in Uyghurs, Taiwan, and Hong Kong issues? You mentioned you could observe their body language and facial expressions. Is there anything you would like to share how you analyze their self-censorship during your interview? Sorry, it's long. I had experience that my participants had a lot of self-censorship in my fieldwork. Thanks.
Thank you. So first of all, I did not ask about the taboo topics because I had asked a research visa and I had, of course, an ethical approval from my university, and I had to remain within the scope of what I had said I would do. So I never went with questions on Tiananmen or Taiwan or Hong Kong or that type of questions. Some people brought them up, but I followed up very carefully and then changed the topics because you have to be sure you don't endanger the participants as well. I want to show you, if I may, very briefly, and I still maybe.
Sorry, I moved to the other screen because I was looking at that, so maybe now.
Okay. So regarding body language and how I manage that. So first of all, the persons used specific language, like they didn't say this is political, they say this is sensitive. Sometimes they wouldn't say the government, they would say the country. So I used whatever language they used. If I noticed that they use sensitive, I would say sensitive and so forth. I use non-threatening questions. If someone is put on the blacklist, not if you are put on the blacklist. Again, very careful. There are reports that your score could go down if, it's not my ID, it's not me saying that. Other people said that. So body language, people keeping silent longer than usual. And for those of you who do qualitative research, silence is a big helper. So you need to allow silence in an interview, but really longer than usual. So people would stay silent, I would wait, and then they would open their mouth and they would not say anything, would wait, they would close the mouth. And then they opened it, and then two ways. Either they launched into a full-pronged, propaganda discourse, speaking very, very fast, very easy, because that is something that was safe grounds for them, because they had decided not to say. Or they would say what was on their mind, either way. But that was one telltale sign. A specific body language that I have never observed in any of the other countries that have done interviews. People would open their mouths and they would swallow back their saliva as if they wanted to say something, but they were not going to say it. It was very, very particular. They would shake their head, agitate their hands. They would look down. They would toy with their phones. Well, there's a way to see if someone is being uncomfortable in an interview. And in that case, what I did is cycle back and forth between easy question, like what do you post on WeChat? What do you love about WeChat? Do you answer to your boss when he, sends you an email in the weekend? Well, WeChat text in the week. And then when the person was breathing again, had recovered their colors in the face, you could go to maybe more difficult questions. But people had so many ways of saying they didn't want to discuss or we needed to change topics. They would say, I don't know, I'm low educated, I cannot answer your question. Or they would say, no, I'm not interested in politics. They would stop dead. The person who said it's not to protect us, that's not the reason, stopping dead. And then, you have to really, really quickly change the subject. This person was quite rude, I won't answer this question. Okay, and then signaling to the interviewer, that was really interesting as well. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you. I just got a message from Ellen saying we have to shut down. I'm sorry, Anna. Thank you very much for our online audience. I think it will now be closed because we're out of time. Thank you very much again to our speaker.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions.